Wyoming Territory, 1873. The wind howled across the sagebrush-covered plain like it had something to say, but no one cared to listen. Not here, not today. The wedding was over in less than 15 minutes. No music, no kiss. Just a slip of paper passed between two men, and a young woman standing still as stone between them. She wore no white dress, just a faded blue cotton gown and boots that had seen better days. Brietta Ellery stood silent beside the wagon, hands folded, jaw clenched, while the man her father owed money to, a rancher named Clarence Dray, climbed up on the seat and took the reins. Her father, eyes low, gave a nod and walked away without a word. That was it. No goodbye, no look back. Just gone. You belong to me now, Clarence muttered, not bothering to look at her. Brietta didn't answer. She climbed onto the wagon seat like a shadow and stared ahead, her hands tight in her lap. She was 23 and had worked the Ellery land with her father since she was old enough to carry a bucket. But the land had dried up, the cattle died, and her father had borrowed more than he could repay. Clarence had come collecting. They rode in silence for over an hour before Clarence stopped by a creek to water the horses. Brietta stepped down and walked a few paces away just to breathe. Her chest felt tight, her head heavy. She heard Clarence's boots hit the dirt behind her. "You're mine now, girl," he said, low and rough. "Time you start acting like it." Before she could turn, he grabbed her arm. That was the moment it happened. A voice cut through the wind. "Let her go." They both turned. A man on horseback approached, tall in the saddle, his long coat dusted with trail dirt, his hat pulled low. His horse was bay-colored, steady and quiet. The rider stopped a dozen yards off, his hand resting easy on his thigh. Clarence's grip tightened. "You best ride on, cowboy. This ain't your business." The man dismounted with calm, deliberate movements. "It is now." His name was Quentin Zane. Brietta had never seen him before, but the way he looked at her like he saw her, not just some girl being traded off, made her chest ache with something she had not felt in months. Worth. Clarence let go of her arm, but not without a sneer. "She's my wife." Quentin looked at Brietta, then back to Clarence. "She's a person, not something to hand over like a sack of grain. You married her under pressure, and I saw enough to prove it." Clarence stepped forward, hand at his belt, but Quentin was quicker. He drew his pistol and aimed it steady. "Walk away." Clarence scowled, but he saw the calm in Quentin's eyes and the steadiness of his hand. He knew better than to test it. With a curse, he backed off, mounted his wagon, and turned back the way he came, wheels kicking up dust. For a moment, nothing moved. The wind rustled dry branches. A hawk circled overhead. Then Quentin turned to Brietta. He holstered his gun and stepped closer, slow and easy, like he would not spook a frightened mare. His voice was low, steady. "You are no one's but yours." Her eyes stung. She tried to say something, but it caught in her throat. Instead, she nodded. "You got somewhere to go?" he asked. She shook her head. "No family left. The ranch is gone." He looked toward the horizon, then back at her. "I have a cabin about 10 miles west, small place but clean. You can rest there, stay as long as you need. No one will touch you." She studied his face, the rough jaw, the tired eyes, the dust on his sleeve. There was no pity in his voice, just quiet truth. And right now, that was more than anyone had offered her in a long time. "I do not want to be a burden," she said. "You will not be." They rode together on his horse, her behind him, holding on with stiff arms at first. But as the miles passed, her grip softened and her cheek rested against his back. It felt strange, trusting a stranger. But something told her Quentin Zane was not like other men. The cabin sat against the base of a rocky hill, tucked between cottonwoods. There was a corral, a barn, and a small garden patch turned for spring. He helped her down from the saddle and led her inside. The place was warm, with a fire already going and a kettle on the hook. "You can have the bed," he said. "I will sleep out here." "You do not have to, I want to," he said, and that was the end of it. That night, Brietta lay under a quilt, staring at the ceiling beams. She heard the faint sound of Quentin moving around the hearth, then settling into a chair. No talking, no questions, just peace. The days passed slow but steady. She helped in the garden, boiled water, even mended one of his shirts. He showed her how to feed the chickens and where the creek ran deepest. She cooked, he chopped wood. Neither of them asked for anything. Still, something quiet began to grow between them, the kind of thing that needed no name. One morning, she found him outside, mending a fence. She brought him water, and as he drank, she studied his face in the morning light, the strong line of his jaw, the scar near his brow, the way his eyes crinkled when he squinted toward the sun. "You were not afraid," she said quietly. He set down the cup. "I was. Of Clarence?" "No." "Of seeing someone treated like they did not matter. That scares me." She looked down at her hands. "I am not used to kindness." "You deserve it." Their eyes met. Something shifted. Not fast, not loud, just real. She reached out, her fingers brushing his. He covered her hand with his, rough and warm. "I do not know what comes next," she whispered. "We will figure it out," he said. And for the first time in a long while, she believed that was true. The thaw came slow that spring, turning the hills soft and dark with melt. Days stretched longer, though the wind still carried a bite, and the mornings smoked with frost. Crows called from the cottonwoods, and the creek rumbled louder with each passing day. Brietta stood barefoot on the porch, sleeves rolled, scrubbing the last of the winter soot from the windows. Her hands ached, but she didn't stop until the glass caught the light. Inside, Quentin stacked a few books into a crate and moved a cracked kerosene lamp to the shelf near the fireplace. The rhythm of their days had settled into something steady, not routine but known. Like a song hummed under breath, she heard his boots on the steps before he spoke. "I'll be riding out early tomorrow. A neighbor up near Hat Creek needs help with branding. Might take a couple days." She turned, wiping her hands on her skirt. "Will they feed you?" He gave a quiet nod. "They always do. I'll take jerky just in case. I can wrap you some bread if there's flour left." "There's enough." He hesitated, then touched the brim of his hat, not out of habit but thought. "You'll be all right here." She folded her arms. "I've been alone before, I know." His voice dropped a little. "But you don't have to be now. If you'd rather, I can ask the neighbor's wife to ride back with me and stay till I return." "I'd rather you didn't." She didn't look away. "I'd like to try standing here on my own. Just a little longer." He gave a single nod, then stepped down and walked toward the barn, the late light painting long shadows across the yard. She watched him go, something tightening in her chest, not fear, not anymore. Just the ache of wanting someone to come back. That night, she packed his satchel while he sharpened his knife by the fire. She tucked the heel of bread beneath a folded cloth, added dried apples, then paused. Her fingers hovered over the small tin that held her sewing needles. She slipped it in beside the food. Quentin noticed. "You planning to mend something out there?" "I thought maybe." She didn't finish. Her cheeks warmed. "Just in case your coat tears." He looked at her, the corners of his mouth tugging with something unreadable, then he reached forward and took her hand. "Thank you." In the morning, he was gone before the sun cleared the ridge. She found his note beside the kettle, 3 words, careful and square. "Back soon, Quentin." She touched the paper once, then set it by the window. The cabin felt different without him. She kept the fire going, tended the hens, and swept the floor twice, though it didn't need it. On the second evening, clouds moved in from the west, heavy and gray. The wind picked up, and she bolted the shutters before nightfall. She was stirring beans on the stove when the knock came. Her breath caught. She set the spoon down and reached for the iron poker. The knock came again, slower this time. When she opened the door, a woman stood there, soaked through, clutching a bundle to her chest. "I'm sorry," the woman said quickly, voice hoarse. "My wagon gave out near the ridge. Wheel split clean through. My boy's got a fever." Brietta stepped aside without thinking. "Come in. Sit by the fire." The woman moved fast, not grateful, just desperate. Her son was no more than 5, swaddled tight and burning with heat. Brietta fetched a basin, soaked cloth, and began to cool his face. "What's your name?" she asked as the woman wrung out her skirt. "Lena. My husband's still at the wagon. He's trying to rig something to keep it upright. I came here hoping." "You did right." Brietta turned the child gently. "He's breathing steady. That's good." Lena wrapped her arms around herself. "You live here alone?" "No." Brietta didn't explain further. They stayed the night. She gave them the bed and sat near the hearth, watching the fire rise and fall. The boy's fever broke just before dawn. When Lena's husband arrived, soaked and shaking, she fed him without question. By the time Quentin rode in late the next afternoon, the strangers were gone, leaving behind a pair of patched gloves as thanks. He stepped down from his horse and looked around, brow furrowed. "You had visitors," she nodded. "A family in trouble. They're safe now." He set his satchel on the porch. "You all right?" "I am." She brushed her hands against her apron. "I kept things warm." He reached toward her, then paused. "I don't want to presume, but I missed you." Her throat tightened. "I missed you too." He took her hand. This time she didn't hesitate. By late May, the foothills wore green again. Grass swayed high enough to hide the rabbits, and the apple tree behind the cabin had begun to flower in pale, trembling blossoms. Quentin had hammered a new latch on the barn door that morning, and Brietta was on her knees in the garden, pressing beans into warm soil, when a crow flew low over the cabin and settled on the fence rail. She glanced back at it, then stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "I don't trust birds that bold," she said as Quentin approached, carrying a coil of rope over one shoulder. He squinted at the bird. "Might be looking for scraps, or looking for trouble." She tilted her head. "You ever been east of the Missouri?" He rested the rope against the porch and leaned one shoulder to the post. "Once. Briefly. I was 17 and thought I could outwork a sawmill crew in St. Louis. Turned out they didn't want a cowboy full of grit, just men who could work 12 hours without throwing up from the noise." She laughed, quiet and surprised. "Did you stay long?" 2 weeks. Then I walked most of the way to Kansas City and got hired on by a cattle drive heading west." "I didn't look back." She nodded, then knelt again, fingers moving along the trench in the soil. "I've never been more than 50 miles from where I was born." "You miss it." "I miss the parts that never truly belonged to me, the sound of my mother's humming when she stirred stew, the way the light used to come through the barn slats at dusk. But not the rest. Not the waiting for things to go worse." He stepped off the porch and crouched beside her. "I've been thinking on something." She didn't look up. "Go on." "This land, it's more than I can handle alone. I've been pulling the same hay from the same field for 5 years now. But there's a stretch of pasture past the ridge I've never cleared. Too much work, and I'd no reason to." She dusted her palms on her skirt. "And now you do, I might, if you'd want it, a place to put a few goats. Maybe a milk cow if we can trade for one." She stood slowly, the sun warming her back. "You're offering me a patch of your land. I'm offering you roots if you want them." She met his gaze, steady and full. "That's not a small thing." "Nothing about you is," he said. She turned away, walking toward the edge where the garden met the slope. She stood there a long while. The wind moved through the budding branches overhead, and the crow finally gave up and flew off. That night, she sat by the hearth with a needle in hand, mending a thin tear in the pocket of Quentin's shirt. He was reading, one boot resting on the edge of the table, the other planted firm. The cabin smelled faintly of pine pitch and the biscuits she'd baked with the last of the lard. "I'd like a goat," she said. He looked up. "And maybe 2 hens of my own, not those half-wild ones in the coop. I want ones that'll let me feed them from my hand." He set the book aside. "We'll ride into town next week. There's a man at the livery who keeps goats. I'll ask after hens too. You think people will talk? They probably already are." She gave a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "I don't care. Neither do I." He stood and crossed the room. She felt the warmth of him before she saw his hand reach for hers. She let the shirt fall into her lap. "I don't want you to feel owed," he said. "Not ever, I don't. I want you free even if you stay." "I am free," she said, "and I'm staying." For the first time his hand came to her cheek, gentle and sure. She leaned into it, eyes closing. Outside, the wind had settled. The fire ticked low. She opened her eyes and looked up at him. "I don't know how to be in love," she said. "You're doing fine." When he kissed her, it was quiet, not rushed, not uncertain, just the meeting of 2 people who had waited long enough. And when she kissed him back, there was nothing held back. Not fear, not memory, just her, all of her. Later, when the lamp had been turned down and the quilt pulled across both their shoulders, she lay with her head tucked beneath his chin and whispered, "I never thought I'd be here." "You belong here," he said. "Exactly here," and she believed him. The clouds that rolled in by the first week of June were heavy with rain and too stubborn to let it pass quickly. The soil near the barn puddled thick and deep, and the creek narrowed to a fierce ribbon, chewing at its banks with a sound like teeth grinding. Quentin nailed boards over the worst leaks in the chicken coop, while Brietta kept her hands busy inside, setting old flour sacks into strips for rags and steeping willow bark for aches that had returned to her knuckles. One morning, while the rain slowed to a steady tap on the roof, Quentin returned from the woods behind the cabin, his coat soaked and his hat dripping. He carried a length of fresh-cut pine slung over one shoulder, bark still clinging to its damp sides. "I saw tracks," he said, setting the log down just inside the door. "Deer, maybe 2 days old, headed south." She pulled her shawl closer. "You'll follow them?" "Not yet. I'd rather cure the roof first. Keeps leaking over my cot." She tilted her head. "We could trade for tar if we ride east." "You said there's a blacksmith near the river fork." He nodded, pulling off his hat and hanging it near the stove. "We could, but it'd take both of us to haul back what we need. I can ride." He leaned his back against the wall, his eyes on her hands. "There's something else I want to show you on the way." She paused, then set down the strip of cloth. "Where?" "Up past the ridge, north slope. There's a hollow I've been clearing a little each year, never told anyone about it." Her brow furrowed. "Why not? Didn't have a reason to before." "Figured I'd die before I made it useful. But the soil's darker than down here, and there's a spring that don't freeze even in January." She stepped closer, her voice low. "You want to build something there, if you're willing. A second cabin, maybe. Or a loft up high for drying herbs, storing grain, something that's ours from the start." Her fingers curled against her skirt. "We'd need handsaws, nails, maybe a mule to drag the beams. I've got most of it. Been collecting scrap and tools longer than I care to admit." She looked up at him, her voice quiet but sure. "I want that." They rode out 2 days later when the rain let up and the sun returned in sharp, clear light. The trail past the ridge was overgrown with chokecherry and wild rose, and they dismounted to walk the last stretch, brushing aside branches and ducking under limbs slick with dew. When they crested the rise, he stopped and pointed. The hollow below was ringed with cottonwoods, their leaves just beginning to turn silver in the breeze. The ground was soft and flat, with moss-covered stones marking the edges where a creek curved around. In the center, a half-built frame leaned against a pile of rough-cut boards, weathered from years of waiting. "I started that when I first bought the land," he said. "Didn't know what I was building. Just knew I had to build something." She stepped forward, her boots sinking slightly in the damp earth. "It's beautiful." "I thought about burning it down more than once," he admitted. "Felt like it was mocking me, just standing there unfinished." She turned. "You didn't." "I couldn't." Something in me kept saying, "Wait." She looked back at the frame. "I think I was meant to stand here." He came to her side. "So do I." They spent the rest of the day hauling what they could from the pack horse, sorting through the boards, testing each for rot. She tied her hair back with twine and took to the hammer like she'd been born holding it. He saw her hands blister, then harden. She never complained. By the time the sun dropped low, they'd raised a second wall. Not tall, not finished, but solid. She leaned against the frame, breathing hard. "Feels like we've claimed something." He handed her the canteen. "We did." That night, back at the cabin, she took down the sewing tin from the shelf, the one she'd packed for him that first trip. She opened it and removed a folded scrap of paper she'd tucked inside weeks earlier. She handed it to him without a word. He unfolded it slowly. Inside was a rough sketch of a cabin drawn in pencil, 2 rooms, a porch, a stove in the corner and a garden behind. Beneath it, one word, "Ours." He looked up at her, eyes steady. "You drew this before I ever said anything." "I had a feeling." He folded it carefully, set it on the table, and reached for her hand. "You always know before I do." She leaned in, forehead against his. "I only know what I want." Finally. And when he kissed her again, it wasn't the beginning of something uncertain, it was the answer to everything they'd built, board by board, word by word, hand in hand. By late summer, the cabin in the hollow was nearly complete. The roof stood firm under cedar shakes Quentin had traded for with a neighbor who'd fallen behind on salt. The porch faced west, where the light sank slow and golden across the slope. Brietta had carved a small pattern into the edge of the windowsill, nothing fancy. Just a row of climbing vines while he shaped a bench from leftover pine. They slept there for the first time on a Sunday after the last of the joists were nailed and the floor swept clean. She lit the lamp with a match struck against her boot heel, and the glow spread soft across the bare wood. She laid one quilt on the bed and another on the floor, though neither of them ended up needing the second. She woke early the next morning with her back warmed by his arm across her waist. The birds had begun to stir outside, and the wind moved through the hollow in a hush that felt almost reverent. "I never sleep past dawn," she said, voice still rough with sleep. "That's what peace sounds like," he murmured. They didn't rise for another hour. When they did, she cooked cornmeal cakes on the iron skillet he'd brought down from the first cabin, and he boiled coffee grounds in the battered tin pot. They ate on the porch, legs stretched out, bare feet brushing. Later that day, while they cleared brush near the creek's bend, she found a stone shaped like a heart. It was lopsided, more round on one side than the other, but she kept it in her apron pocket and said nothing. Quentin glanced over. "You're quiet today." She wiped her brow. "Thinking about how I never had anything that felt finished before." He leaned on the spade, watching her. "It's not done yet, I know. That's why it's good." They spent the next weeks laying smooth stones for a path between the cabin and the water, gathering moss for the root cellar, and setting posts for a fence. She planted turnips by the porch and set aside seed for next spring. He built a smokehouse out of salvaged timbers with notched shelving for drying meat. One night, as she stitched a hem by the fire, he pulled a worn pouch from beneath the bed and laid it on the table. Inside was a ring. Not polished or decorative, just a band of hammered silver, slightly dented along one edge. "I bought this 6 years ago," he said. "Didn't know who it was meant for. Carried it through Wyoming winters and Missouri dust." She touched it gently. "It's got marks," he nodded. "So do we." She slid it onto her finger. "It fits." I hoped it would. They didn't speak of weddings or ministers or papers. Some things didn't need ink to be true. That fall they traded eggs and dried beans to a passing tinker for a second kettle and a wool blanket. Brietta made a coverlet from scraps of linen she'd found in the barn's loft, dyed with crushed blackberries and soaked in vinegar to hold the color. Quentin carved a shelf for her to keep her thread and needles, and she kept his sharpening stone in a tin box beside it. Come October, they hosted supper for the neighbor couple from down past the ridge, the ones whose goats had kidded late. They brought honey and a jar of pickled beets. Brietta served rabbit stew with sage, and Quentin poured cider they'd pressed from windfall apples. The talk was slow and easy, and when the couple rode off by lantern light, Brietta stood at the porch rail a long while, watching until the glow faded. Quentin joined her, hands tucked in his pockets. "You miss town?" "I don't know yet," she said. "But I don't miss being watched like I'm something broken." "You never were." "I was bent," she said, "but I'm not anymore." Winter settled fast after that. Snow came early, piling high against the barn and drifting across the path to the creek. They moved between the two cabins as needed, hauling firewood by sled and splitting work between them. He read aloud sometimes in the evening, his voice low and patient, while she mended gloves or ground dried herbs for tea. One night, as the smoke curled steady from the chimney and the snow whispered against the windows, she took the heart-shaped stone from her apron and set it on the shelf. "I kept that," she said, "in case we forgot what this place is." He looked at it, then at her. "I won't forget." She stepped into his arms, her forehead resting against his collarbone. "Neither will I." The next spring the garden sprouted early, and the hens laid twice what they had the year before. The hollow bloomed with wild phlox and creeping thyme, and the bees returned in numbers. A doe dropped her fawn near the edge of the creek, and Brietta watched it stand for the first time, its legs shaky but sure. When the first warm rain came, they stood outside and let it soak them, laughing like children too wild to care. The earth smelled of turned soil and green things rising. Quentin pulled her close, kissed her with his hands in her wet hair, and said nothing at all. Years passed. The cabins weathered but held. The garden grew deeper roots. They built a second fence, then a third. In time, they took in a girl whose family had perished in a fire and raised her like she was their own. They taught her to read, to ride, to mend, to build. She slept in the loft above the hollow cabin, and her laughter echoed off the trees. Brietta never returned to the town where she was born. She never needed to. In the quiet evenings when the chickens had settled and the fire crackled low, she would sit near the window with her sewing while Quentin read beside her. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't, but their hands always found each other's. They built a life that held. Not perfect, but whole. And together, they lived out their days with the steady joy of people who had once been lost and found their way home.